In our last lecture, we looked at three of the most famous flood stories in the world, two from Mesopotamia and one from Genesis. And we treated them as part of the creation myth cycle, since the deluge is really a kind of death of the old and an emergence of the new. In this lecture, we'd like to take a look at six more flood stories from four different cultures, all of which have slightly different emphases, meaning that even if, as we've suggested before, even if the genre of flood stories have a lot of things in common, they're almost always deflected in particular cultural directions. We're going to look at a Greco-Roman one, an Indian one, three Chinese flood stories, and then a rather harrowing one of the Aztecs from Mesoamerica. One of the motifs that appears in quite a few flood stories is that the flood is sent as punishment for wickedness. In the Noah story, this is very explicit. It's to a lesser extent in the Mesopotamian stories, where the issue isn't really wickedness, but noise due to overpopulation. The other stories, in other flood stories in other places, follow a similar pattern. Zeus sends a flood to punish humanity for the misdeeds of the Titan Prometheus. The Shewang people of Malaya have a myth in which the flood is sent as a punishment for people laughing at animals. The serpent who lives under the earth is angered and irritated, and he releases primal waters to punish the offenders. In northern Australia, there's a myth of two sisters who have sex with members of the same clan. They're swallowed by a half-human, half-serpent who then provides the flood. After the waters have subsided, the sisters and the babies they have born are spit back out into what becomes the first initiation ground, one of those places where young men are taught who they can marry and who they can't. So, as in so many other flood stories, here the world emerges different and slightly better than it was before. The flood is always seen as a kind of purification, a kind of baptism, and the human race always begins again as the survivors of the flood. One of the more famous flood stories in history is a Greek story, which is in its most famous telling is from Ovid's Metamorphoses. Ovid was a Roman poet who lived at the very end of the 1st century BCE and into the 1st century CE. Even though we do a minimum of Greek and Roman myths in this course simply because there are other teaching courses available on classical myths, this one illustrates so well some of the generalizations we've made about flood myths. It's a beautifully told story, and it may have important connections with some of the Middle Eastern myths we looked at last time that it's worth taking a look at. The Metamorphoses is a polished literary work which was written for a literate and sophisticated audience. The purpose of the poem was not to tell myths per se, rather its purpose was to illustrate Ovid's theme of change or metamorphosis. The myths that he tells in the process of this poem are told engagingly and in witty fashion. Some of them are very, very funny, meaning that Ovid takes an entirely different attitude toward his material than, say, the Enuma Elish does toward its myth, or the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or the Hebrew Bible, which are mostly very serious about what they're doing. Sometimes Ovid manages to use a myth in a way that's at odds with the original point of the myth, and he's not above changing the myth, or details of it anyway, to suit his purposes when he needs to. Still, we know this myth from other sources. It's brilliantly told, and hence it's worth our attention. In this Greek myth, as in so many other ones, Zeus calls a council. Actually, he's called Jupiter because Jupiter is simply the Latin name for Zeus. So Jupiter calls a council of the gods in which he says he is just annoyed, irritated, disgusted with the behavior of human beings, and he has made a decision to destroy the entire race. When he's asked for details, he says that he wants to save the world to make it safe for the nymphs and the fauns and the satyrs and the nereids, who are being crowded out by human overpopulation and who are always in danger of being corrupted by humans. The other gods say, okay, but who's going to do the sacrifices? Who's going to make sacrifices for us? And Jupiter says, not to worry. As soon as I destroy this old bad race, I'm going to create a new one, which will be much, much better, and the sacrifices will start again. That's the way the flood gets set up in this story. Ovid then gives some really great descriptions of the flood, and this is part of the really beauty of this poem. Jupiter locks up all the winds except the south wind, which he releases to open up all the rain clouds of the world. Then he has his brother Neptune release the seas and the rivers so that they all overrun their banks. And then Ovid gives us this long series of amazing pictures. People rowing boats over fields that they had been plowing just a few hours earlier, or rowing boats over the tops of their own houses. Sea lions playing where goats had grazed just a few moments earlier. Nereids swimming in their usual element underwater, coming across cities and homes and groves underwater that had never been there before. Dolphins bumping into underwater trees. One pair of humans, Deucalion and Pyrrha, survive. They're in a boat and they manage to stay alive until they get grounded on Mount Parnassus. And when they do, they realize they are the last two human beings alive. They are the entire human population of Earth. Jupiter sees them too, and he recognizes them as pious, innocent, good people. So he decides he won't pursue his flood to the bitter end. He allows them to survive. He has the flood abate. But they aren't sure what to do next. It's one of those things, if you imagine yourself in this situation, the last pair of humans in the world, what do we do next? Where do we go from here? They decide that the best thing to do is to go consult an oracle. So they find the oracle of Themis, and they ask the oracle, what do we do? What's our next move? And the oracle says, scatter behind you the bones of your mother. Now we know that oracles always speak enigmatically and that their pronouncements have to be interpreted. And so it takes them a while to figure out exactly what this means. What does it mean to throw the bones of your mother behind you? They eventually come to the understanding that their mother is Mother Earth. And as we've seen in all of those alloforms we looked at in earlier lectures, bones are always the equivalent of stones. So here we have the idea that pick up some stones. Those are the bones of our Mother Earth. And then they start walking with them, throwing the stones behind them as they walk. When they hit the ground, Deucalion stones turn into men and Pyrrhas turn into women, which, as Ovid said, made a very, very tough, strong race because they were made, after all, from stones. Animals are recreated after this flood by spontaneous generation. We've talked about this before, too. Ovid reminds us that this is what happens each spring in Egypt when the flood recedes and out of the slime, amphibians and reptiles are spontaneously generated. So after this flood, that happened, Ovid said, over the entire earth. There are a lot of typical flood elements and motifs in this story. The flood is sent as punishment. The world is recreated after the flood. The survivors become the ancestors of all humans. It's a kind of interesting detail that Greece isn't subject to floods, so this story must have come from somewhere else. Usually people assume that it must have made its way to Greece from the Near East, complete with such details as mountaintops covered with water. Connections with the Near East may even be closer than that, and scholars have suggested that Prometheus in Greek myths might really be the same figure as Ea or Enki in Sumerian and Babylonian myths. He, remember, is the one who saves mankind in their flood stories. The idea is strengthened by details of the poem. In various versions of this story, Prometheus and Pandora are the parents of either Deucalion or Pyrrha. In Ovid, in fact, Deucalion is Prometheus' son, and so the connection between these figures, these helper figures, seems very, very precise and very close. So this may be why the Greek version and the Near Eastern version have so many parallels, and this may account for why that happens. The biggest difference between this story and the ones that we looked at last time is that no one makes any special effort to save Deucalion and Pyrrha here. They survive entirely by accident, and Jupiter relents only when he recognizes their goodness, and so that their survival is not prepared for. No god helps them. Nobody helps prepare the way for them to survive. If anyone helps them in this story, it's the oracle of Themis, who tells them how to create this new race, one, in this case, made out of stones. That's Ovid's flood story. The Indian flood story that we'll look at is part of a larger cosmogony, featuring, as we mentioned before, those alternations of creation and destruction. Each cycle lasts 100 years in the life of Brahma, but billions of years in Earth time, Because as we said, each day in Brahma's life is the equivalent of 4,320 million Earth years, and each one of those is divided into 14 ages. Each one of those ages is ruled over by someone called a Manu, a father of the human race. In Hindu terms, we're now in the 7th age, and its Manu is, by tradition, the author of the Vedas, or at least the transcriber of the Vedas. Every one of these cycles begins with a great flood, and often one great sage is allowed to survive from one age into the next, so the next stage doesn't have to begin absolutely from scratch. The Manu of this Indian story is one such figure who has survived from one age into the next. He had practiced so many austerities that he had reached a level of power virtually equal to that of the gods. His story is that one day, while he is washing his hands in a bowl of water, he comes across a little tiny fish inside that bowl, and the fish says, please save me. Bigger fish will eat me, so protect me, save me in some kind of way. Manu, a kind-hearted man, agrees to do this. First, he puts the fish in a little bowl, a jar, until it outgrows that. Then he puts it in a big pit in the ground, and it outgrows that. Then he puts it in the Ganges, and eventually it outgrows that. Finally, he puts it into the sea, and as he puts it into the sea, the fish tells him, I really am Vishnu, and I will protect you, I will save you from the next flood. So all you have to do is follow what I tell, do what I tell you, and I will save you from the next flood. When the flood actually happens, the fish tows Manu's ark that he has built out to sea and then turns him loose, and he manages to ride out the entire flood. He has also taken with him a few sages and a few other supplies and manages to ride out this great flood. When the flood begins to subside, Manu manages to find a tree sticking out on the top of a mountain somewhere, and he moors his ark to that tree. And then the fish comes by again and says, I think this is a bad idea. Do you realize once you've moored your boat to that tree, as the waters recede, you're just going to be hanging out there, hanging from that tree on a mountainside. So he unties his boat and then allows it to recede until the floods subside, and then the work of the new creation can begin again. The next age is underway. In one version of the story, a really nice happy ending to this, Manu worships that fish and practices more austerities. And at some point, he's offering a sacrifice of butter, curds, and whey, which transform themselves into a beautiful young woman who, with Manu, begets a race of humans and receives other blessings. A new cycle is really underway. An important difference between this flood story and some of those we've looked at earlier is that the Hindus do see destruction and creation as being alternating parts of the same cycle. The age of destruction is a debased age. It's an age in which morality has deteriorated from what it was earlier, but there's no special opprobrium attached to this. It's not like in earlier stories where the gods become angry and said, I can't stand this anymore. This is expected. This simply happens. As the wheel keeps turning, the axle eventually wears out, and when destruction is needed, it happens. And then because Hinduism is such a cheerful religion in so many ways anyway, the people who are destroyed in the flood aren't totally, absolutely destroyed. They are all, in fact, working out their own karma. And so those who have already achieved an age of the stage of liberation will simply be allowed to become one with Brahman. And those who haven't yet achieved that liberation, that stage of liberation, will simply be reborn again and keep working their way up that ladder. So this is really, in some ways, even more positive than other flood myths, which are generally purifying. Here, individuals are not even really destroyed. They will either join Brahman or they come back and keep climbing up that ladder. The next collection of myths we'll look at are from China. And as we mentioned earlier, Chinese generally preferred abstract philosophy to mythologies. We said there are fewer myths generally in China than there are in other parts of the world. And hence it's really unusual to have a wide range of flood myths. This is the most pervasive kind of myth in China, and there are at least 5 big ones, which later on were combined into 3 very, very large flood myths. The first one features a war among the gods, maybe something like the war that the Titans and the gods in Greek mythology fought. In one of these battles of hand-to-hand combat, a giant named Kung Kung is fighting with the god Xuan Su, and he collides with one of the 4 mountains that are holding up the sky. The one, in fact, in the northwest corner. And the sky falls down in that particular place once its prop has been removed. Floods are just one of the catastrophes that happen, and in one version of the story, this fallen mountain is never repaired. It means that ever since then, the sky and the earth have sloped toward each other in the northwest, and they've tilted away from each other in opposite directions, in the opposite direction. So that's why, this is an etiological myth, that's why, according to this myth, all stars move in a westerly direction as they slide down the sky as it tilts down, and why all rivers run east to the sea, because they're simply following the slope of the land in that direction. There's another version of this story in which all 4 of the mountains that are holding up the world collapse and allow the sky once more to fall on top of the earth, putting us back into the same kind of condition that we were when Rangi was lying closely on top of Papa in the Maori myth we looked at. In this version, a goddess named Nukua saves the world by smelting stones to repair the vault of heaven, which had broken when it fell down, and then uses the feet of a giant turtle to prop it back up again, to put it back in place. She also, while she's at it, makes dams to stop the floods and to repair things that had been broken. And her repairs usher in a great golden age for China. The seasons are regular and the beasts are orderly and serpents cover their fangs and animals don't bite and people work happily all day and sleep dreamlessly, sweet sleep at night. According to scholars, that first version of the one corner of the sky falling down and the one with all 4 of them fell down were later on combined, so that Nukua's repair was thought to be a repair as parts of the same story. Nukua turns out to be a really interesting figure in Chinese mythology. She began as a very powerful goddess, as we can see from this story. She even, as in a story that we looked at sometime earlier, is considered a creatrix, someone who created human beings. But as we see her move through the history of Chinese mythology, she's downgraded bit by bit, piece by piece. Eventually she becomes a consort of a god rather than a goddess herself. And then finally she is required to marry her own brother, as a way of instituting human marriage among children. In fact, the third story that we have here, the third Chinese flood story, features her in one of her roles as a human being rather than as a goddess. In this story, she is the child of a father who is a farmer, and when the god of thunder introduces this huge flood on the earth, it is the farmer who manages to capture the god of thunder, to cage him up, and then to sort of dehydrate him so that when you dehydrate the god of thunder, the flood stops. Everything goes back to normal. He still has the god of thunder locked in a cage, and one day when the farmer goes to work, the god of thunder talks the children into giving him a drink of water. It sounds harmless, but of course, as soon as the god of thunder gets a drink of water, he is rehydrated, he bursts out of the cage, and the flood is on again. But he thanks the children for helping him, and what he does is he leaves them a tooth and he tells them to plant it, which they do, and a few moments later a fully grown gourd plant emerges with one huge gourd on it. When the father returns home and sees the flood is back on again, realizes what's happened, he tells his children to get inside the gourd, and the gourd becomes in fact their ark in this flood story. He floats to heaven in a boat, and he asks the gods to please make the flood stop, which they do, but the god of thunder stops the flood so abruptly that his boat crashes to earth and he's killed. Everybody else is wiped out by the flood itself, and as with Deucalion and Pyrrha, this brother and sister, after the flood subsides, realize that they are the last and only human beings on earth. When they grow up, the boy suggests that they marry, or mate at any rate, to start repopulating the earth. But she's really reluctant. She says, we're brother and sister after all, this is not appropriate. But eventually she says, I'll start to run. If you can catch me in this chase, I'll submit. She runs, he catches her, she submits. And in the process, as a result of their mating, she gives birth to a great ball of flesh, which they then slice up into little tiny pieces and start carrying on a ladder up toward heaven, a ladder that stretches from earth to heaven. As they're climbing, a gust of wind blows these little pieces of flesh all over the earth, and every time one of them lands, it becomes a human being. And so this is the way that the earth gets repopulated. This is Nuku'a in a different role, and we'll come back and visit her again because she's a very interesting goddess, as is her career through Chinese mythology. The most famous Chinese flood story is one that again combines two stories into one. There's a story that at the time of one really, really great flood, the gods assigned a human named Kun to deal with the floods. And he works for 9 years. He works tirelessly. He works his fingers to the bone. He becomes a mere shell of himself as he works for these 9 years. And he fails to stop the flood. He seems to be working primarily with dams to try to dam up the water, and it doesn't work. To complicate his failure, he seems to have stolen something like, it's called swelling soil, from the gods themselves in an effort to make these dams that he hopes will stop the flood. So the gods are upset both by his failure to stop the floods and by the theft of their swelling soil. So at the end of 9 years, they give up on him. They take him to a mythical place called Feather Mountain. It's a sunless place in the north, and they execute him. They just put him to death, that's that. But miraculously, his body does not decompose. Rather, it turns into stone, and several years afterwards, that stone gives birth to a son named Yu, who will turn out to be even more famous than his father, and who will be the one who in fact learns how to stop the flood. Kun's story has various kinds of endings, not all tragic. It seems to us that he was treated pretty unfairly by the gods, but his story comes out slightly happier. In some versions, he's changed into a bear or a fish or a turtle or a dragon and plunges into Feather Gulf. In other versions, he makes his way to the west where a shamanist restores his original shape. So he's out of the picture, but he winds up okay anyway. In the meantime, his son Yu takes over his father's task of stopping the flood. Instead of trying to make dams, he uses a winged dragon, and he has the dragon drag its tail to make channels for the water to run off to the sea. And he also, while he's at it, Yu rids the marshlands of snakes and dragons, and he readies these marshlands for human cultivation. As he drains them, he also prepares them for human cultivation. In related myths, he still has some of his father's swelling soil left, and he uses it to heap up mountains. He conquers a host of rebels and monsters, and he wins allegiance, according to the myth, from 10,000 different states. Then he marries a mortal woman who bears him a son. Again, this is a miraculous birth because she gives birth to the son after she too has been changed into stone. And the father and son together then found the legendary Xia dynasty. Yu goes on to become a splendid culture hero. There are many, many, many other myths and legends that have gathered around him. In none of the Chinese stories, and this is one of the ways in which we can see individual cultural deflections, I think, in none of these stories is the flood sent as punishment. Rather, the flood stories are really parts of the way creation is finished off and then made habitable and useful for people. So the emphasis in these stories is not on the flood itself, but on the tasks that are done to make the earth fit for human cultivation. All of the flood stories are about divine beings who create the conditions for Chinese civilization. The last one even manages to establish a dynasty. Only the one with Nuku'a has much in common with the earlier myths, because it has a flood that wipes out humankind except for one pair who ride it out in a kind of ark, a gourd ear, and repopulates the earth. It even has an axis mundi in it, that ladder that reaches from earth to heaven. And the segmented balls of flesh, which are carried by gusts of wind, land on the ground and create new human beings, are a little like the stones thrown by Deucalion and Pyrrha as they walked along, throwing the bones of their mother behind them. So again, what we're suggesting is that all flood stories, even if they have a lot in common, are all deflected in terms of the concerns of the culture that creates them. Finally, we'll end with what seems to me one of the most terrifying flood stories of all, at least in its implications, that of the Aztecs. The Aztecs came very late to the Valley of Mexico, and they conquered and absorbed cultures that had been there since about 1500 BCE. Like the Babylonians and Assyrians in the Middle East, they adapted and absorbed materials that had been in place for about 3,000 years, including the importance of blood and human sacrifice for maintaining the cosmos. The flood story for them is part of the creation myth, as it was for the Navajo. We remember that the Navajo, those insect people in the Navajo emergence myth, are flooded out of their first underground chamber by great walls of water that come at them from all four directions. In the Aztec myth, there turn out to be four creations before this one. This is the fifth, and each one was a failure because of some moral lapse, either on the part of the creatures who live on it, or because of conflict among the gods competing for the position of supreme god. The story begins with a dualistic god who's both male and female. This is quite typical, we've seen this before, who gives rise to four Tezcatlipoca's. Each one is associated with a different element and a different cardinal direction. Each one of those in turn manages to a creation of his or her own in which he or she is the most important deity. Each one in turn is resented by the other three, who then bring that work of creation down to give him or her a chance to try a hand at creating him or herself. Each creates a world and an era which is identified with a certain sun and with a certain cataclysm that destroys it. The first sun is called the Four Jaguar, and it lasts 676 years until Quetzalcoatl throws Tezcatlipoca into the water, and earth and inhabitants are all consumed by jaguars. The second sun is called the Four Wind, and it ends when Tezcatlipoca avenges himself by throwing Quetzalcoatl off the throne, and the world is destroyed this time by hurricanes. The third sun is called the Four Rain Sun, and it is dominated by fire and ruled by the rain god Tlaloc. And that one ends when Quetzalcoatl gets revenge by sending a fiery rain to destroy the earth. The fourth sun is associated with the water goddess, and it ends with a flood when all living things are destroyed. The people of this world are turned into fish when the flood happens, as earlier humans had been turned into monkeys and turkeys. In this flood, it's so devastating that even mountains are washed away, so that the heavens come crashing down on the earth. All that remains of those first four creations are the monkeys, the turkeys, and the fish. The fifth sun, the one that we are living in now, was created jointly by Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl. In one version, they create the universe out of the dismembered body of the great Earth Mother. By now, that's a familiar motif. We've run across that before. They tear her apart, and from the upper part of the body, her body, they make the earth, from the lower part, the sky. This is a slight inversion. Usually it's the other way around. But everything that humans need comes from her body. Her hair becomes trees, flowers, and herbs. Her skin makes grasses and smaller flowers. Her eyes produce wells and springs and small caves. From her mouth come the great rivers and canyons. From her nose, mountain ridges and valleys. She is still thus in the earth. She is the earth. And ancient Aztecs said you could hear her screaming at night, screaming for sacrificial flesh and blood that can soothe her so that she can keep producing what humans need to survive. Beyond this point, the world is created, but in this fifth world, there are no people yet. And humans are created by grinding up the bones of the fish people of the last sun and mixing it with the blood of the gods. The creation of the sun involves more sacrifice. Two gods have to leap onto a flaming pyre to make the sun and the moon, and then a group of gods have to have their own hearts cut out to make the sun and the moon move. The point here is that this cosmos for the Aztecs is the fifth in a series of failures, and this one is still very fragile. It's due to be destroyed by earthquakes, and then there will be a sixth. Meanwhile, a steady diet of blood and human hearts is required to keep this delicate cosmos alive, and hence the horror stories we have about the capture and sacrifice of thousands of human beings, their beating hearts cut out on the great temple steps to keep this creation alive. And here's one of those places where myth and ritual are perfectly superimposed. Thus we have, as we have seen, every flood story, regardless of what its elements are and regardless of which elements it has in common with other flood stories, is culturally deflected. It's nuanced in ways that allow it to serve in its own culture and serve cultural functions itself. The next time we'll conclude our unit on creation myths by looking at myths of the apocalypse, myths of cosmic destruction, in which creation myths are told backwards, and all of creation collapses once more back into primeval chaos. That's next time.